Amara's office is a glass cage, suspended 40 floors above the city. From the outside, she is the Iron Queen, a woman who breathes strategy and bleeds ambition. But tonight, the silence in the room is heavy. A tabloid photo, a blurred image of her looking unstable, has sent the board of directors into a frenzy. To them, a single woman at the top is a liability. To the investors, she's a flight risk. If she doesn't present a united, married front by the time the merger papers are signed next month, they'll strip her of everything she's built. Her pulse thrums against her ribs, a frantic rhythm she refuses to let reach her face. She doesn't have a lover, and she certainly doesn't have a friend. She has employees, and she has enemies. To save her legacy, she needs a ghost. A man who can occupy the space beside her without demanding a piece of her soul. Then there's Minju. He's waiting in the lobby, leaning against the marble wall like he owns the building, despite the simple jacket he wears. They'd crossed paths once before, a brief electric collision in a crowded elevator where he hadn't moved an inch to make way for her entourage. He didn't look at her with awe or greed. He looked at her like he could see right through the expensive armor to the exhausted woman underneath. When he's called into her office, the atmosphere tightens. Amara stays behind her desk, using the mahogany as a shield. She lays out the terms. A year of his life, a massive payout, and a strict list of rules. No touching, no prying, no reality. She expects him to flinch at her coldness or jump at the money. Instead, Minju just watches her. His gaze is steady, almost pitying. He doesn't look at the contract. He looks at the way her knuckles are white from gripping her pen too hard. He's the only person in the world who doesn't seem to care about the billionaire Amara Cole, and that makes him the most dangerous man in the room. I don't need love, she says, her voice a sharp blade in the quiet room. I need control. Minju finally smiles, a slow, knowing tilt of the lips. Control is an illusion, Amara. But if you want to pay me to watch you try and keep it, I'm in. The ink on the contract was barely dry before the walls Amara had spent years building began to rattle. She had designed every clause to be a cage, a set of ironclad rules meant to keep Minju in his place. No emotional involvement, no unscripted physical contact, no interference in her business or private affairs. She expected a nod of submission, the quiet compliance of a man who knew he'd just won the lottery. But Minju didn't even read the final page. He signed his name with a careless flourish, his eyes never leaving hers. There was a faint, mocking light in his expression, not of greed, but of amusement. To Amara, that paper was her shield. To him, it was just a scrap of dead wood. When she tried to dictate his schedule for the upcoming gala, he simply checked his watch and walked toward the door. The first public appearance was a disaster for her nerves. She had scripted every word he was supposed to say. But the moment the cameras flashed, Minju went off book. When a high-profile investor tried to talk down to him, Minju didn't play the humble, lucky husband. He spoke with a sharp, piercing honesty that silenced the room. Ignoring the frantic warning glares Amara shot his way. He wasn't acting like a programmed partner. He was acting like a man who answered to no one, especially not her. Back in the sleek, suffocating silence of her penthouse, the power struggle turned physical. Not with violence, but with presence. Amara tried to assert her dominance, pacing the floor and lecturing him on the chain of command. She was used to men shrinking when she raised her voice, used to the world bowing to her title. Minju didn't move. He stood in the center of her pristine living room, a thumb hooked in his pocket, looking as unbothered as if she were reciting a grocery list. His calmness felt like a direct assault on her authority. It wasn't anger that flared in her chest. It was a dizzying, unsettled curiosity. Why wouldn't he break? Why did his shadow feel heavier than hers in her own home? She stepped into his personal space, her heels clicking sharply on the marble, trying to use her height and her status to force him into a retreat. She wanted him to acknowledge the hierarchy. She wanted him to remember who bought his time. Minju didn't flinch. He leaned in, just enough for her to catch the scent of cedar and cold air, his gaze dropping to the contract she held like a weapon. He reached out, his fingers grazing the paper before pushing it aside. "You're used to people obeying you, Amara," he said, his voice a low, steady vibration that made the air feel thin. "I'm not one of them." In the days that followed, the friction between them didn't ignite into fire. It settled into a low hum of tension that Amara couldn't switch off. She tried to retreat back into her routine, drowning herself in spreadsheets and late-night strategy calls, treating Minju like a piece of furniture she'd temporarily moved into her home. But while she was busy trying to ignore him, Minju was doing something far more dangerous. He was watching. He noticed the things the world missed. He saw how her hand trembled slightly after a 10-hour day of being scrutinized by the board. He noticed the untouched meals left on her desk and the way she stared out the window at midnight, her reflection looking fragile against the city lights. He didn't offer empty platitudes or forced romance. Instead, he intervened with a quiet, unsettling precision. When she was too buried in a crisis to breathe, a glass of water and a simple plate of food would appear at her elbow. No words spoken, no credit claimed. When she fell asleep at her desk, she would wake up in the morning to find a blanket draped over her shoulders and the lights dimmed. It wasn't the grand gesture of a lover. It was the basic care of one human recognizing the exhaustion of another. Amara found herself hesitating. The sharp commands that used to fly off her tongue died in her throat whenever he entered the room. She began to watch him too. She watched the way he moved through her space with a grounded confidence that didn't require her permission. Her confusion grew like a physical weight. Why was he doing this? There was nothing in the contract about kindness. There was no bonus for making sure she didn't collapse from burnout. One evening, the mask finally slipped. After a grueling merger negotiation that left her feeling like a hollow shell, Amara slumped onto the sofa, her head in her hands. The isolation of her position had never felt heavier. For years, she had been the one everyone leaned on, the one who couldn't afford a single mistake. She felt a presence beside her. She didn't look up, expecting a lecture or a question about the schedule. Minju sat down, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He didn't ask her to talk. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He simply stayed there, a silent anchor in the middle of her storm. In that stillness, Amara realized that the fear she usually inspired in people, the fear she used to maintain her power, was completely absent here. Everyone else looked at her and saw a paycheck, a boss, or a rival. They stayed away because they were intimidated by the ice. But Minju sat in the cold beside her, unbothered and unmoving. A terrifying thought took root in her mind, shifting the very foundation of her world. She looked at his profile, his eyes steady on the horizon, and the truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had spent her entire life building a throne out of intimidation, believing that being feared was the only way to be safe. But as she looked at the man she had supposedly hired to be her puppet, she realized the one thing she never expected to find in a partner. He doesn't fear me. The day of the final merger arrived like a storm breaking over the city. Amara stood at the head of the boardroom table, the cool glass under her palms, a familiar comfort. This was her arena. She had the numbers, the leverage, and most importantly, she had the image of the perfect, settled wife waiting at home. She felt a surge of triumph, As the opposing partners whispered in hushed, intimidated tones, she was seconds away from total victory. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open. The air didn't just chill, it vanished. Amara's heart skipped a beat as a figure stepped into the light of the high-rise windows. It was Minju, but the man she had left in her penthouse that morning was gone. The simple sweaters and indifferent shrugs had been replaced by a suit that cost more than most people's homes, tailored with a precision that screamed old, untouchable money. He didn't walk like a guest or a supportive husband. He walked like the owner of the world. The board members, men who had looked down on Amara for years, stood up in unison, their faces pale with a sudden, desperate respect. Amara's breath hitched. Confusion fought with a rising sense of dread. She opened her mouth to ask what he was doing there, to tell him to leave before he ruined the deal. But the lead investor spoke first. "Mr. Kang," the man stammered, bowing his head. "We didn't realize you'd be attending the closing in person." Amara felt the floor tilt beneath her heels. Mr. Kang, the silent partner, the shadow figure behind the multi-billion-dollar conglomerate she was trying to merge with, had a name no one dared speak. And that name belonged to the man she had hired to wash her dishes and play a part for the cameras. Minju didn't look at the board. He walked straight to the head of the table, his presence pushing Amara to the periphery of her own kingdom. He pulled out a chair, his movements slow and deliberate, and finally leveled his gaze at her. The warmth she'd felt in the quiet moments at the penthouse was gone, replaced by the hard obsidian shine of a predator who had played the long game. He hadn't been a victim of her contract. He hadn't needed her money. He had been the one holding the pen all along. He had known her debt, her scandal, and her secrets before she'd even known his face. He had let her believe she was the master, let her treat him like a puppet, all while he watched her from the center of the web. The humiliation was a physical weight, crushing the lungs out of her chest. Every moment of vulnerability she had shown him, every time he had seen her tired or small or broken, felt like a weapon he had forged against her. She wasn't the powerful CEO saving her company. She was a child playing dress-up in front of a king. The room cleared as if on his silent command, leaving them alone in the vast, echoing space. Amara's voice was a ghost of itself, trembling with a fury she couldn't hide. "Who are you?" Minju stood up, stepping around the table until he was inches from her. He didn't reach for her, but the air between them was electric with betrayal. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, the man she thought she knew vanishing into the shadow of the man he actually was. "I was never the man you hired," he said, the words cold and final. The silence in the boardroom was no longer professional, it was surgical. Amara felt like she'd been laid open, her pride bleeding out onto the polished wood. She wanted to scream, to throw the heavy crystal decanter at his perfect, deceptive face, but her throat was tight, with a different kind of pain. This wasn't just a business lie. This was personal. Every night he'd spent in her home, every meal he'd quietly placed before her. It wasn't kindness. It was surveillance. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "To humiliate me, to watch the Iron Queen beg for a fake husband before you crushed her company?" Minju didn't flinch. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city as if he already owned every brick. "I didn't come for your company, Amara. I came for justice." He turned back, his eyes dark with a history she didn't recognize. He began to speak of a smaller firm, a family legacy, that had been liquidated, gutted, and discarded by Cole Enterprises 10 years ago. He spoke of a father who lost his mind and a family that vanished into the shadows of poverty because of a signature on a merger document. Amara froze. 10 years ago, she was still in university. Her father had run the company then, with a ruthless hand that she had spent the last 3 years trying to soften. She realized, with a sickening old adult, that the very inherited damage she had been working 18-hour days to repair was the wound Minju carried. He had entered her life to destroy the monster that had devoured his world, only to find a woman who was drowning while trying to fix the monster's mess. The betrayal cut both ways. Minju had expected a villain. He found a woman who skipped meals and slept on her office sofa to pay back debts she didn't personally owe. Amara had expected a partner. She found a man who used her vulnerability as a roadmap for his revenge. They stood on opposite sides of a legacy built on blood and ink, both of them victims of a past they couldn't change. "You sat at my table," she said, stepping toward him, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. "You watched me break down. You saw me at my weakest, knowing you were the one pulling the rug out from under my feet." "I saw a woman who wasn't who I thought she was," Jube countered, his voice losing its icy edge. "I waited for you to show your father's cruelty. I waited for the greed, but it never came. Because it's not me," she flared, the realization of his judgment hitting harder than his deception. She thought of the families she'd quietly compensated, the ethical shifts she'd fought the board to implement. She looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of being blamed for a sin she didn't commit. "You think I would have allowed that?" She gestured to the city, to the company, to the ghost of his father's pain. "If I had known?" The air in the boardroom turned brittle, thick with the scent of a dying fire. Amara stood her ground, her chin tilted high even as her world crumbled. She waited for a retraction, an apology, or even a spark of the warmth they'd shared in the quiet of her kitchen. But Minju remained a statue of expensive fabric and hard choices. The man who had tucked a blanket over her shoulders was gone, replaced by a stranger who had looked into her soul only to find a debt he couldn't forgive. Minju stepped back, the distance between them growing until it felt like an ocean. His hands were clenched at his sides, fighting the urge to reach for the woman he had spent months trying to hate and failing. He saw her pain, saw the honesty in her eyes, but the ghosts of his past were louder than the beating of his heart. He had come for a war, and winning it felt more like losing everything. He looked at her one last time, his expression a fractured mask of regret. "I spent my life hating your name, Amara," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "And then I met you. Now, I don't know if I fell for you, or the version of you I wanted to believe in to justify what I've done." The words were a final blow, more devastating than any corporate takeover. He was telling her that even their connection was a calculated risk, a shadow play in his theater of revenge. He turned toward the door, his shadow stretching long across the floor, waiting, perhaps for her to scream, to bargain, or to plead for him to stay. But Amara was a creature of pride. She felt the salt of unshed tears burning her throat, but she didn't move. She didn't call his name. She had spent her life being told she was too much or not enough, and she refused to beg for a man who saw her as a variable in a mathematical equation of justice. She watched his back disappear into the hallway, her heart drumming a slow, hollow rhythm against her ribs. The heavy doors clicked shut, the sound echoing like a gavel. In an instant, the frantic pressure of the merger, the scandal, and the contract vanished. She was alone in her kingdom, surrounded by billions of dollars and a terrifying, absolute emptiness. Silence replaces control for the first time. The silence in the penthouse wasn't a void anymore. It was a mirror. For weeks, Amara didn't chase the ghost of Minju through the city streets or blow up his phone with explanations. Instead, she went into the basement of her own empire. She traded her silk blazers for the dust of the archives, digging through decades of sealed files and redacted signatures. She found the truth buried under layers of corporate greed. The cold, calculated destruction of Minju's family that happened while she was still a child. She saw the numbers. She saw the lives ruined for a 3% bump in her father's quarterly earnings. For the first time, Amara didn't look at her company as a legacy to be protected, but as a debt that had to be paid. She realized that while she wasn't the one who swung the hammer, she was the one living in the house built from the wreckage. She began the work in the dark. Without a single press release or a leaked memo, she started the silent repair. She moved millions into trust funds for the families her father had displaced. She signed over land titles and issued formal legal corrections to the reputations her predecessors had smeared. She didn't use the company's legal team. She used her own private wealth, dismantling her personal safety net to bridge the gap her family had created. She wasn't doing it to win him back. She wasn't doing it to look like a hero in the eyes of the board. The need for control, the desperate itch to be the one holding the strings, had finally burned away. In its place was a quiet, steady resolve. She was fixing the world not because she wanted him to see her differently, but because she finally saw herself. The Iron Queen was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that true power wasn't in commanding others, but in the courage to be just. One evening, as she sat in the dim light of her office, the door opened. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The air always felt heavier when Minju entered a room, a familiar pull that made her heart ache with a dull, constant throb. He stood by the desk, a folder in his hand. The records of the restitution she'd made, the quiet justice she'd served to his people. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for a sign of a trap, a hint of the old Amara, who did everything for a return on investment. He looked tired, the hard edges of his revenge softened by a confusion he couldn't hide. He opened his mouth to ask the question that had been haunting him since the first check cleared, to ask if this was another play, another contract, another way to keep him bound to her. Amara beat him to it. She didn't look for his gratitude. She didn't ask for his forgiveness. She simply closed her laptop and stood up, meeting his gaze with a clarity she had never possessed when they were legally bound. She saw the man who had been her greatest mystery, and she finally felt no need to solve him. "I wasn't doing it for you," she said, her voice a calm, unbreakable vow. The office was vast and quiet, the city lights outside twinkling like distant cold diamonds. Minju didn't move. He looked down at the documents in the folder, the weight of them finally sinking in. He had spent years fueled by a singular, burning purpose: to tear down the house of Cole. He had expected to find a fortress of greed, but instead he found a woman who had quietly dismantled the walls herself. She hadn't called the press. She hadn't tried to buy his favor. She had simply looked at a wrong and made it right, even if it meant weakening her own empire. He stepped closer, the space between them no longer a battlefield. The air felt different, thinner yet easier to breathe. He looked at Amara, seeing the dark circles under her eyes and the steady, quiet strength in her posture. For months, they had played a game of shadows, each trying to outmaneuver the other. Now there were no more shadows left to hide in. The truth was laid bare between them, more intimidating than any corporate secret. "You did the right thing," Minju said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration in the stillness. He looked at her, his eyes dark, with a complicated grief. "But that doesn't erase everything. It doesn't change the lies, or the way we used each other. It doesn't erase the 10 years my family lost." Amara didn't flinch. She didn't offer excuses or remind him that she was just a child when his world fell apart. She didn't point out that he had lied to her just as deeply as she had lied to him. She just watched him, her gaze clear and unafraid. "I didn't do it to erase anything," she said, her voice soft but absolute. She paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the room. "I did it because it was right." In that moment, the power dynamic that had defined them, the billionaire and the husband, the predator and the prey, finally collapsed. There was no dominance here. No one was winning. They were just two people standing in the wreckage of its history they hadn't chosen, trying to figure out what was left. Minju saw the woman behind the title, the one who chose justice over survival. Amara saw the man behind the revenge, the one who was finally realizing that his war was over. Minju reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out his copy of the marriage contract. It was creased and worn, a physical reminder of the day they had decided to use each other. He looked at the ink, at the cold clauses, and the rigid rules she had drafted to keep her heart safe. Without a word, he caught the edge of the paper and tore it down the middle. The sound of the rip was sharp, like a gunshot in the quiet office. He tore it again and again, until the symbols of her control were nothing but white scraps of paper falling onto the mahogany desk. Amara watched them fall, feeling a strange, light sensation in her chest. The cage was open. He didn't beg for her to stay. He didn't promise her a fairy tale. He simply stood there, his presence no longer a threat, but an invitation. They weren't bound by a legal document or a shared enemy anymore. The silence was no longer a weapon. It was a bridge. Amara stepped around the desk, stopping just inches from him. She didn't need to look up to know she was his equal. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about the next move, the next merger, or the next scandal. She was just thinking about the man standing in front of her. "The plan failed," she whispered, the corner of her mouth tilting up in a tired, honest smile. Minju reached out, his hand resting gently on the small of her back, not to pull her in, but to steady her. "Maybe the plan was the problem," he replied. The contract was gone, the secrets were out, and the power was shared. In the heart of the empire she had almost lost, Amara finally found the one thing she could never buy. She found a partner who didn't want to control her, but to walk beside her, and loving him was the only thing she had ever done that was truly her own. The silence between them felt different now. It wasn't a wall, but a sanctuary. Amara looked up at Minju, her reflection clear in his steady dark eyes. For years, she had survived by predicting every move, scripting every word, and ensuring no one ever got close enough to see the cracks in her armor. She had built a world based on logic and leverage. Yet here she was, standing in the ruins of her most careful strategy, feeling more powerful than she ever had behind a desk. Minju's hand moved from her back to her neck, his thumb tracing the pulse that hammered against her skin. He wasn't looking at the billionaire or the legacy. He was looking at the woman who had finally chosen herself. The air was thick with the scent of cedar and the cooling city night, a quiet witness to the moment their masks finally fell away. A soft, breathless laugh escaped her lips, the sound of a woman finally letting go of the steering wheel. She leaned into his touch, the last of her resistance melting into the heat of his palm. "I had everything figured out," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of truth. "Every clause, every contingency." She looked at the torn scraps of the contract on her desk, then back to him. "And loving you was never part of the plan.